The dust kicked up from his worn leather boots as Jake Morrison rode into the settlement of Broken Arrow, Texas, on that sweltering August evening in 1847. At barely 19, with calloused hands that had never drawn iron in anger and eyes that still held the innocence of youth, he was about as green as they came in these unforgiving territories. His father's Colt Navy revolver hung heavy at his hip, more burden than comfort, its weight a constant reminder of the legacy he was supposed to carry but had never truly earned. The town stretched before him like a mirage, weathered buildings casting long shadows across the dirt main street, while the dying sun painted everything in shades of amber and blood. What Jake didn't know was that this night would strip away every last vestige of his boyhood and replace it with something far darker, something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The Comanche sisters were waiting, though he had no way of knowing it yet, and their plans for the young gunslinger would change the very fabric of who he thought he was. Jake had come to Broken Arrow chasing ghost stories and half-remembered tales his grandfather used to tell around the fire. Stories of 3 Comanche women who could supposedly bend men to their will, who commanded respect and fear in equal measure across the territory, and who had never been seen together by anyone who lived to tell about it. Most folks dismissed such talk as frontier nonsense, the kind of legends that grew like tumbleweeds in the vast emptiness of Texas. But Jake's grandfather had been different, his eyes holding a haunted quality whenever he spoke of the sisters, his voice dropping to a whisper as he described their otherworldly beauty and their terrible power. Now, with his grandfather 6 months in the ground and nothing but questions left behind, Jake had decided to seek out the truth for himself. The townspeople he'd asked along the way had given him strange looks, some crossing themselves when he mentioned the sisters by name, others simply turning away without a word. But here he was anyway, drawn by curiosity and perhaps something deeper, something that called to him from across the years like a siren song he couldn't ignore. The saloon doors swung open with a familiar creak as Jake stepped inside, the sudden dimness momentarily blinding him after hours under the blazing sun. The place was nearly empty, just a few weathered cowboys nursing their whiskey at the far end of the bar, and an old-timer playing a melancholy tune on a battered piano. The bartender, a mountain of a man with scars crisscrossing his face like a roadmap of violence, looked up from polishing glasses with eyes that had seen too much. Jake approached the bar with what he hoped passed for confidence, ordering a whiskey despite having little experience with anything stronger than his mother's apple cider. The liquor burned his throat, but he managed not to cough, maintaining what he thought was a stoic expression while the bartender studied him with obvious amusement. When Jake finally worked up the courage to ask about the Comanche sisters, the entire saloon fell silent, the piano player's hands freezing over the keys as every eye in the place turned toward him. The bartender's expression shifted from amusement to something approaching pity, his massive hands still holding the glass he'd been cleaning. He leaned forward across the bar, his voice barely above a whisper when he spoke, telling Jake that some stories were better left alone, that some legends carried a price too high for any man to pay. But Jake persisted, his youthful stubbornness overriding the warning bells that should have been ringing in his head. The old-timer at the piano finally spoke up, his voice cracked and weathered like old leather, saying that the sisters lived in the canyon 3 miles north of town, in a place the locals called Devil's Throat. He warned Jake that men who went looking for the sisters usually found more than they bargained for, that some came back changed, speaking in tongues and carrying shadows in their eyes, while others never came back at all. Despite the warnings, or perhaps because of them, Jake felt his resolve only strengthen. He finished his whiskey, tossed a coin on the bar, and headed for the door, ignoring the murmured prayers and worried glances that followed him into the night. The ride to Devil's Throat took longer than expected, the narrow canyon trail winding through increasingly treacherous terrain as the moon rose higher in the star-filled sky. Jake's horse, a reliable mare named Duchess, seemed increasingly agitated as they climbed, her ears laid back and nostrils flaring at scents and sounds that Jake couldn't detect. The canyon walls rose on either side like the ribs of some enormous beast, their red sandstone surface seeming to pulse with hidden life in the shifting moonlight. Strange sounds echoed from the depths ahead, not quite human but not entirely animal either, causing the hair on Jake's neck to stand on end. When he finally reached the place the old man had described, a natural amphitheater carved from the living rock. He found 3 figures waiting for him around a fire that burned without wood, its flames dancing in colors that had no name. The Comanche sisters were nothing like what Jake had imagined, and yet everything his grandfather's stories had promised. The eldest, who introduced herself as Ayanna, stood nearly 6 feet tall with muscles that spoke of a lifetime spent in combat, her dark eyes holding depths that seemed to contain entire worlds. Her sisters, Kachina and Ciala, flanked her on either side, each beautiful in her own terrifying way, each radiating a power that made the air itself seem to shimmer around them. They wore traditional Comanche dress but carried themselves with an authority that transcended any earthly tribe, their movements flowing like water over stone as they beckoned Jake to approach their impossible fire. When Ayanna spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries, telling Jake that they had been expecting him, that his grandfather had made a bargain long ago that was finally coming due. The words hit Jake like a physical blow, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon before he remembered that such gestures were meaningless here, in this place where the normal rules no longer applied. Kachina stepped forward then, her smile both welcoming and predatory as she explained that Jake's grandfather had traded something precious for their protection during the worst of the Apache raids, something that could only be reclaimed by blood or by choice. Jake's mind reeled as memories flooded back, images of his grandfather's unexplained absences, the way he'd always seemed to know when trouble was coming, the strange scars on his arms that he'd claimed came from a mountain lion but had never quite looked right. Ciala, the youngest of the 3, moved with fluid grace around the fire, her hands weaving patterns in the air that left trails of light, explaining that their grandfather had promised them his firstborn male descendant in exchange for their protection, a debt that had been passed down through the generations like a family curse. Jake felt his world tilting as the implications sank in, understanding finally why his grandfather had always looked at him with such sadness, why he'd insisted on teaching Jake to shoot despite his mother's protests, why he'd filled his head with stories of the frontier that most children never heard. The fire began to change as the sisters continued their explanation, its flames reaching higher and taking on shapes that Jake's rational mind refused to accept. He saw his grandfather as a young man, surrounded by Apache warriors with blood on their weapons, calling out to the night sky in desperation as his family huddled in their burning homestead. He watched as 3 figures materialized from the darkness, beautiful and terrible, offering protection at a price that seemed reasonable in that moment of absolute terror. The vision shifted, showing years of prosperity and safety that followed, his grandfather's family growing and thriving under the sisters' watchful protection, never knowing the true cost of their good fortune. Jake realized with growing horror that everything good in his family's life had been built on this foundation of supernatural debt, that his very existence was tied to a bargain he'd had no part in making but would be forced to honor nonetheless. Ayanna's voice cut through his mounting panic like a blade, offering him the same choice his grandfather had been given so many years before. He could walk away now, she said, turn his back on the debt and his family's protection, living free but knowing that the consequences would fall on future generations. Or he could accept the bargain willingly, taking on the mantle his grandfather had prepared him for, becoming something more than human but losing his mortality in the process. The weight of decision pressed down on Jake like a physical force, his young mind struggling to process concepts that seemed to belong in the realm of fever dreams rather than reality. Kachina moved closer, her touch like electricity on his skin, as she showed him glimpses of what he could become, the power that would be his, the centuries of life and purpose that stretched ahead like an endless road. But Ciala's whispered warnings spoke of the price he would pay, the humanity he would lose piece by piece, the isolation that came with immortality and the burden of serving purposes beyond mortal understanding. The fire suddenly blazed higher, illuminating the canyon walls with dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames, and Jake saw other figures emerging from the darkness. Men who had come before him, some recent enough that he recognized their faces from wanted posters, others bearing the clothing and weapons of earlier eras. All of them changed in fundamental ways that made Jake's blood run cold. Their eyes held the same otherworldly quality he'd seen in his grandfather's gaze, the look of men who had seen too much and paid too high a price for knowledge that no human was meant to possess. They formed a circle around the fire, these transformed souls, each one a testament to the choice Jake now faced, their presence a silent chorus urging him to join their ranks. Ayanna explained that these were the chosen, men who had accepted the sisters' bargain and had been remade in their image, serving as guardians and enforcers across the territories, maintaining the balance between the human world and forces far older and more dangerous than anything the frontier had yet produced. Jake's hand trembled as he reached for his grandfather's gun. Not in aggression but in a desperate need for something familiar in this world turned upside down. The weapon felt different now, heavier somehow, and when he looked down at it, he saw symbols carved into the metal that hadn't been there before, markings that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Ciala laughed, a sound like wind through canyon walls, explaining that the gun had always carried their mark, that his grandfather had never told him the whole truth about its origins. The Colt had been a gift from them, she said, forged in fires that burned in places between worlds, designed to kill things that normal bullets could never touch. Every man in his family line had carried it, she continued, each one adding his own essence to its power, making it stronger with each generation until it became something far more than a simple weapon. The revelation shattered the last of Jake's illusions about his family's past, forcing him to confront the reality that everything he'd believed about himself had been built on carefully constructed lies. His grandfather hadn't been a simple frontier settler who'd gotten lucky during the Apache raids, but rather a man who'd made a deal with forces beyond human comprehension, trading his bloodline's freedom for temporary safety. The gun at his hip wasn't a family heirloom passed down through generations of honest work, but a supernatural artifact that had been slowly corrupting his family's soul for decades. Even his own journey to this place hadn't been driven by curiosity or courage, but by compulsions planted in his blood before his birth, drawing him inexorably toward this moment of choosing like a moth to flame. Kachina stepped forward again, her movements hypnotic in the firelight as she began to dance, her steps following patterns that seemed to bend reality around them. The canyon walls began to shift and change, revealing glimpses of other places and other times, showing Jake the scope of the sisters' influence across the territories. He saw cities that wouldn't be built for decades, railways that spanned impossible distances, and wars that would reshape the continent, all of them touched in some way by the sisters' long game. They weren't simply supernatural beings playing with human lives for their own amusement, he realized, but rather agents of some cosmic force, working to guide humanity's development along paths that served purposes beyond mortal understanding. The weight of this revelation pressed down on him like a mountain, making him understand that his choice wasn't just about his own fate, but about the role he would play in shaping the future of an entire civilization. The dancing stopped abruptly, and the canyon returned to its normal appearance, leaving Jake wondering if what he'd seen had been real or simply another manipulation designed to influence his decision. Ayanna approached him then, her expression almost maternal as she placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch burning through his shirt like a brand. She spoke of the loneliness that came with their gift, the burden of watching loved ones age and die while you remained unchanged, the weight of carrying secrets that could never be shared with anyone who hadn't paid the same price. But she also spoke of the purpose it gave, the sense of being part of something greater than oneself, the opportunity to guide and protect humanity from threats they couldn't even imagine. Her words painted a picture of noble sacrifice, of choosing duty over personal happiness, of accepting the burden so that others could live in ignorance and peace. Jake felt the weight of generations pressing down on him, the accumulated expectations and sacrifices of his entire bloodline converging on this single moment. His grandfather's stories took on new meaning now, each tale a carefully planted seed designed to prepare him for this choice, each lesson about courage and duty and sacrifice building toward this ultimate test of character. He could see the path stretching out before him in both directions, the normal life that was still possible if he walked away, and the transformed existence that awaited if he accepted the sisters' offer. Both futures held their own form of damnation, he realized, either the guilt of abandoning his family's legacy or the loss of his humanity in service to powers beyond his comprehension. Ciala began to sing then, her voice weaving through the night air like silk, the melody ancient and haunting and somehow familiar, as if he'd heard it in dreams throughout his childhood. The song spoke of cycles and seasons, of debts paid and prices accepted, of young men who came to the fire and emerged as something else entirely. Jake found himself swaying to the rhythm, his resistance weakening with each note, his rational mind slowly surrendering to the hypnotic power of her voice. The fire grew brighter, its flames reaching toward the star-filled sky, and Jake felt something stirring within him, some dormant part of his nature that had been waiting for this moment to awaken. The gun at his hip grew warm against his leg, responding to the sister's proximity, and Jake realized that the choice had perhaps been made long before his birth, that he was simply playing out a role that had been written in his blood. The moment stretched endlessly, time itself seeming to bend and flow around the supernatural fire, and Jake found himself thinking of his mother back home, waiting for news of his adventure, never knowing that her son might never return in any form she would recognize. He thought of the life he'd planned, the girl he'd been courting back in Missouri, the simple dreams of home and family and honest work that now seemed impossibly distant. But he also thought of his grandfather's haunted eyes, the weight of secrets that had bent his back and lined his face, the burden that would now pass to Jake or to someone else in the family line if he refused. The sisters waited with infinite patience, their expressions sympathetic but implacable, understanding that some choices couldn't be rushed but knowing that only one outcome was truly possible. When Jake finally spoke, his voice sounded strange in his own ears, older somehow, as if the decision itself had aged him beyond his years. He accepted their offer, not out of courage or wisdom, but out of a bone-deep understanding that he'd never really had a choice at all, that this moment had been inevitable from the day he was born into a bloodline marked by supernatural debt. The sisters smiled in unison, their expressions both triumphant and sad, knowing that they'd gained a powerful ally but also understanding the price he would pay for his transformation. The fire exploded outward, engulfing Jake in flames that burned without consuming, remaking him at the most fundamental level, while the canyon walls echoed with sounds that had no earthly source. When the flames finally died down, Jake Morrison as he had been was gone forever, replaced by something that looked the same but carried within it powers and purposes that no normal human could comprehend. His eyes now held depths that reflected centuries of experience he'd never lived. His hands moved with the fluid grace of a master gunfighter despite his lack of training, and the weapon at his hip hummed with energies that made the air itself shimmer with potential. The sisters welcomed him into their circle, explaining his new role as protector and enforcer, showing him the territories he would patrol and the threats he would face in service to their ancient agenda. Jake accepted it all with a calmness that surprised him, his transformed nature already adapting to concepts that would have driven his former self mad with terror and confusion. Tentar Novamenti. The years that followed blurred together like scenes from a fever dream, Jake's new existence unfolding in ways that his mortal mind could never have imagined. He found himself drawn to conflicts across the territories, arriving moments before disaster struck, his enhanced senses alerting him to dangers that remained invisible to ordinary humans. The gun at his hip, now fully awakened to its supernatural nature, never missed its target, whether that target was a rabid wolf threatening a frontier family or something far more sinister that had crawled up from places where the earth grew thin. Jake learned to read the signs that others missed, the subtle wrongness in the air that preceded supernatural incursions, the way shadows fell differently when ancient powers stirred in their slumber. His reputation grew among those who lived on the margins of civilization, becoming known as the Ghost Rider, a figure who appeared when hope seemed lost and vanished again before thanks could be offered. But with each passing month, Jake felt pieces of his humanity slipping away like sand through his fingers, replaced by something colder and more calculating. The girl he'd been courting back in Missouri married a banker and had 3 children before Jake realized he'd stopped thinking about her entirely. His mother aged and died while he remained unchanged, and he found himself standing at her graveside feeling more curiosity than grief, studying his own lack of emotional response with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. The sisters had warned him about this transformation, but experiencing it firsthand was different from any description they could have provided. He watched his reflection in saloon mirrors and saw his grandfather's haunted eyes staring back at him, finally understanding the weight that had bent the old man's shoulders and put lines of sorrow around his mouth. The other chosen became his only companions, men like himself who had been transformed by the sisters' power and now served their mysterious agenda across the American frontier. They would meet sometimes at crossroads or in hidden valleys, sharing information about threats they'd encountered in territories they'd protected. Their conversations carrying the weight of accumulated centuries despite the youth of some of their faces. Jake learned their stories, each one a variation on his own theme of sacrifice and transformation. Young men who had been called to serve purposes greater than themselves and had paid the price in humanity and connection. They spoke in clipped sentences about their duties, avoiding talk of the lives they'd left behind, the dreams they'd abandoned, the pieces of themselves that had been carved away in service to the sisters' grand design. One of the older chosen, a man who'd accepted the bargain during the Revolutionary War and still wore the faded blue of a Continental soldier, took Jake under his wing during those difficult early years. His name had been Thomas Whitmore once, but now he answered only to the title the sisters had given him, the Sentinel of the Eastern Reaches. Thomas had learned to embrace his transformation completely, viewing his lost humanity not as a tragedy but as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. He taught Jake how to read the supernatural currents that flowed beneath the surface of the natural world, how to identify the signs that preceded demonic incursions, and most importantly, how to find purpose in an existence that stretched far beyond normal human concerns. Under Thomas's guidance, Jake learned to see his role not as a curse but as a calling, protecting innocent people from threats they couldn't even imagine. The sisters themselves remained largely absent from Jake's daily existence, appearing only when major threats emerged or when new chosen needed to be inducted into their service. But Jake could feel their presence constantly, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness that guided him toward his next assignment or warned him of approaching dangers. Sometimes he would dream of them, visions that felt more like memories than products of his sleeping mind, showing him glimpses of their true nature and the cosmic forces they served. These dreams revealed that the sisters were far older than they appeared, beings who had walked the earth since before human civilization began, taking on different forms and identities as they guided humanity's development along paths that served purposes beyond mortal understanding. As the decade progressed, Jake found himself increasingly involved in conflicts that shaped the broader course of American history. Though always from the shadows, his influence invisible to the historians who would later chronicle these events. He was present at the California Gold Rush, preventing supernatural entities from feeding on the greed and desperation that drew thousands of men to their doom in the mountains. During the Civil War, he worked to ensure that certain battles unfolded according to the sisters' design, understanding that the conflict served purposes beyond the simple questions of slavery and states' rights that motivated the human participants. The gun at his hip claimed targets on both sides of the conflict, men and creatures who threatened to tip the balance in directions that would have catastrophic consequences for humanity's future development. The weight of these interventions accumulated over time, each decision to take a life or spare one adding to the burden Jake carried in his transformed soul. He began to understand why his grandfather had looked so tired in his final years, why the old man had spoken of the sisters with a mixture of gratitude and regret that Jake had been too young to comprehend. The power came with a terrible responsibility, the knowledge that every action rippled outward through time in ways that could reshape the future of entire civilizations. Jake learned to live with the isolation that came with such knowledge, understanding that he could never share the truth of his existence with anyone who hadn't paid the same price for transformation. In quiet moments between assignments, Jake would sometimes visit the places where his mortal life had unfolded, standing outside his childhood home or walking through the cemetery where his family lay buried. These pilgrimages brought no comfort, only a deeper understanding of how completely he'd been severed from his human origins. The boy who had ridden into Devil's Throat that night in 1847 was as dead as if he'd been buried in the canyon, replaced by something that wore his face but served purposes he was only beginning to understand. Yet Jake found a strange peace in accepting this transformation, recognizing that his sacrifice had protected countless innocent lives from threats they would never even know existed. As the sun set on another day of supernatural duty, Jake Morrison stood on a ridge overlooking the town of Broken Arrow, the same settlement where his journey had begun so many years earlier. The place had grown and changed, new buildings replacing old ones, new faces taking the place of those he'd known in his mortal days. But the essential character of the frontier remained unchanged, that mixture of hope and desperation that drew people to the edges of civilization in search of something better than what they'd left behind. Jake understood now that he was part of that eternal struggle, one of the unseen guardians who ensured that humanity's expansion into the wilderness didn't awaken things better left sleeping in the darkness between worlds. The gun at his hip pulsed with gentle warmth, alerting him to his next assignment. Another town somewhere in the territories where supernatural forces were stirring and innocent lives hung in the balance. Jake mounted his horse, the same reliable mare that had carried him to his transformation, though Duchess had been changed by their long partnership just as Jake had been changed by the sister's touch. Together they rode toward the horizon, guardian and mount merged into a single purpose, carrying the burden of protection that Jake's grandfather had passed down and that Jake would someday pass to another young man foolish enough to seek out legends in the desert night. Behind them, the lights of Broken Arrow twinkled like fallen stars, a reminder of the human world that Jake protected but could never again truly be part of, his sacrifice ensuring that others could live their simple lives unaware of the darkness that pressed constantly against the edges of their reality, held at bay by those who had paid the ultimate price for the power to stand against it.